The phone call came on a Tuesday night in 1973. Muhammad Ali was in his Miami Beach home, and on the other end of the line was Marlon Brando, the greatest actor of his generation, a man who had conquered Hollywood entirely on his own terms. They had never formally met, not in any public setting, not at any party or charity event where the cameras could catch it. But somehow, between these two colossal figures, a conversation had already begun. A conversation that had been happening in letters, through mutual friends, through the quiet channels of two men who understood something about sacrifice that the world did not yet comprehend. What happened in that conversation would forge one of the most unlikely and most deeply hidden friendships in American history. A bond between a black Muslim boxer at the peak of his power and a white actor who had spent decades destroying his own career, deliberately, methodically, to stand for what he believed in. Two men. Two different worlds. One conversation that changed everything. Nobody knew. For years, almost nobody knew. The friendship was kept secret not out of shame, but out of protection. Protection of what these two men were building together. Protection of a truth that Hollywood and the sports establishment didn't want told. But the letters existed. The phone records existed. And decades later, the people who witnessed this bond, who heard them speak about each other in private in moments of unguarded vulnerability, finally broke their silence. What they revealed was not a Hollywood fantasy. It was something far more powerful. It was a story about honor. About two men who had both sacrificed everything for their principles, and who recognized that sacrifice in each other the moment they truly connected. Here is the story, the world in transition. It was 1973. America was fractured. Watergate was consuming Washington. Vietnam was finally ending, but the country was still bleeding from the wound. And in this landscape of national confusion and moral crisis, there were only a handful of figures who represented something uncorrupted, something real. Two of those figures were Muhammad Ali and Marlon Brando, but they existed on completely different stages. Ali was at the absolute apex of his power. He was the heavyweight champion of the world again after nearly 4 years of exile. He had sacrificed his prime years, the years when he should have been collecting titles and cementing his legacy, because he refused to be drafted into a war he didn't believe in. He had been stripped of his title. He had been ridiculed and condemned by the mainstream press. He had been called a coward and a traitor. And then, when the courts finally vindicated him, when the nation's conscience finally caught up with his own, he reclaimed his throne. He was 28 years old, and he was unstoppable again. But he was also isolated. Most of his peers in sports had abandoned him during his exile. The establishment had barely forgiven him, and beneath the bravado, beneath the wit and the charm, Ali carried something that nobody talked about, the weight of knowing he had done the right thing alone. Marlon Brando lived in a different kind of isolation. He was the most respected actor alive, but Hollywood was terrified of him. In 1973, he had already refused his Oscar for The Godfather, a gesture that sent shockwaves through the industry. He had spent the late 60s and early 70s systematically refusing roles, refusing appearances, refusing the machinery that was supposed to grind him into acceptable celebrity. He was fat. He was temperamental. He was considered unmarketable. But he was also the most magnetic presence in American culture because everyone knew why he was doing these things. He had become a political actor in the truest sense, not a propagandist, but a man willing to sacrifice his career for his conscience. Here is what most people don't realize: by 1973, both men were viewed with suspicion. Ali was still controversial, despite his legal vindication. Brando was still radioactive in the industry, still seen as a liability. They were both pariahs in their own spheres. They were both isolated by their principles, and neither one had really found someone who understood that particular brand of sacrifice until they found each other. The secret meeting. But to understand what happened between them, you need to know something that was deliberately kept quiet at the time. In the early 70s, there was a growing movement in Hollywood, a small but powerful circle of figures who were beginning to see Ali not as a boxer or a curiosity, but as a freedom fighter. This wasn't the mainstream narrative. The mainstream narrative was still condescending, still skeptical. But in private, in conversations that never made the newspapers, men like Brando were watching Ali with deep, serious respect. They were seeing something the general public couldn't see yet, that this wasn't just about boxing. This wasn't just about religion. This was about the structure of power in America and whether ordinary people, even famous people, had the right to resist it. Brando became obsessed with Ali's story. He was deeply engaged with the Black Power movement, deeply committed to civil rights activism. But what struck him about Ali was something specific: the loneliness of it. The fact that Ali had done this thing, this revolutionary thing, almost entirely alone. No major studio backing him up. No corporate sponsors protecting him. Just a young man and his conscience. And for Ali, watching Brando from a distance, something similar was happening. He was seeing a man who was willing to destroy himself rather than participate in a system he didn't believe in. That kind of refusal is rare. That kind of conviction is rare. And when you've sacrificed everything for your principles, you notice when someone else has done the same thing. The weight they both carried. By 1973, Muhammad Ali's exile was over, but something inside him hadn't healed. He had gotten his name back. He had gotten his religion recognized. He had gotten his championship back. But he hadn't gotten back something that mattered more. His sense of belonging to his country. He was no longer a pariah in the legal sense, but he was still a pariah in the cultural sense. People still booed him. People still called him unpatriotic. People still couldn't separate the man from the symbol of everything they feared and resented about the 60s. And there was something else eating at him, something that wasn't talked about in public. He was angry. Not performatively angry. The Ali that the world saw was joking and boasting and quoting poetry. But privately, with people close to him, there was a deep, simmering rage at what had been taken from him. 4 years. 4 years of his prime, 4 years when he should have been compiling an untouchable record, 4 years when he should have been building a legacy that nobody could ever touch. Those years were gone. And no amount of vindication could give them back. Brando was wrestling with something different, but equally corrosive. He had been working methodically to dismantle his own career because he believed the machinery of Hollywood was fundamentally corrupt. But there's a particular kind of pain in destroying something you've built. There's a particular kind of doubt that creeps in when you're a pariah in your own industry, when the people who created you are now whispering that you've wasted your talent, that you've thrown away your potential. Brando was fat. He was difficult. He was taking roles in bad movies because he wanted money and didn't care about prestige anymore. Or at least, that's what people told themselves. But the truth was more complicated. He was exhausted. He was tired of fighting. And he was beginning to wonder if his sacrifice had actually meant anything. Here's what changed everything in 1973. A mutual friend, a man named Jim Brown, the legendary football player and civil rights activist, brought them together, not in person, but through correspondence. Jim Brown understood both men. He understood what they had sacrificed, and he believed that they needed to know each other. The first connection, The first letter from Brando to Ali arrived without fanfare. It was personal, it was deep, and it did something that no one else could do. It validated Ali's sacrifice in a way that mattered. Brando didn't praise him as an athlete. Brando didn't congratulate him on his comeback. Instead, Brando spoke to something deeper. He spoke about what it costs to refuse. What it costs to say no to the system that wants to use you, that is designed to use you, that has every incentive to use you. Ali's response came back quickly. And in that response, something extraordinary happened. Ali called Brando his white brother. Not as a casual phrase, not as a political statement, but as a recognition that they had walked parallel paths through parallel worlds, and that they had both ended up in the same place alone, vindicated, but still isolated by the very principles that had vindicated them. For Brando, receiving that letter, receiving that acknowledgement from someone he deeply admired, it was transformative. He had spent years questioning whether his choices mattered. He had spent years wondering if he was just being difficult, just being egotistical in a different way. But Ali's letter told him something he needed to hear: your sacrifice was real. Your conviction was understood, and you are not alone. The hidden correspondence, what followed was months of letters. Not a handful of letters, months and months of sustained correspondence between these two men. They discussed philosophy. They discussed race and identity. They discussed what it meant to be a black man in America and what it meant for a white man to stand alongside that struggle. They discussed the burden of principle, the loneliness of conviction, the particular pain of being vindicated while still being marginalized. Brando was in his 50s by this point. He had stopped acting almost entirely. He was living semi-reclusively, still politically engaged but increasingly isolated. Ali was in his early 30s, still compiling his record, still fighting, still in the spotlight. But in their letters, these age differences and career differences dissolved. What remained was a conversation between two men who had each made a choice that cost them something irreplaceable and who needed to be understood by someone who got it. But here's the crucial part: they didn't let this friendship become public. They didn't pose for photographs together. They didn't give interviews about their connection. This wasn't performative activism. This wasn't a photo opportunity. This was real, and precisely because it was real, it had to be protected. In Hollywood and in sports, visibility equals control. The moment their friendship became public, it would be commodified, analyzed, turned into a statement about race or politics or celebrity. So instead, they kept it secret, the question nobody asked, but there's something important to understand about this secrecy. It wasn't hiding out of shame. It was protecting something sacred. And it raises a question that most people never think to ask. What happens when two of the most famous people in the world decide that their real connection is too important to be public? What happens when the most profound relationships are the ones that nobody else is allowed to know about? The answer is something real emerges, something uncorrupted by the machinery of fame and press and narrative control. Something that belongs only to the two people involved. In early 1974, Muhammad Ali decided to do something unprecedented. He decided to visit Marlon Brando at his home. Not at a public place. Not in a restaurant, or at an event where they could be photographed. Ali traveled to Brando's house in the dead of night, with minimal security, with almost no one knowing where he was. For a man of Ali's stature, a man who was constantly followed, constantly watched, this was a significant act of commitment. This was not casual friendship. This was deliberate, intentional, and carefully planned. When Ali arrived, Brando was waiting. They sat together. And for hours, we're talking about a conversation that stretched into the deep night. They talked. Not about boxing. Not about movies. They talked about the thing that nobody else could understand, Shangale, what it felt like to sacrifice everything and then live in the aftermath of that sacrifice. Ali told Brando about the years of exile. He told him about the nights when he doubted himself, when he wondered if he had made a catastrophic mistake. He told him about the vindication that came too late to give back what had been taken. He told him about the anger that lived beneath the smile and the boasting and the performance. Brando told Ali about the work he had done in the civil rights movement. He told him about the guilt he carried, the guilt of being white and trying to be an ally without it becoming about him. He told him about the way Hollywood had tried to break him, not through overt rejection, but through the slow machinery of irrelevance. He told him that he no longer knew if he was an actor or if he had become a political gesture, but to understand what this conversation truly meant, you have to know something about the late 60s and early 70s that most histories leave out. There was a real movement happening. Not the sanitized, commodified civil rights movement that history textbooks describe, but a real, ongoing, dangerous movement where people were literally risking their lives. And both Ali and Brando were implicated in this movement in ways that went far beyond their public personas. Ali wasn't just a boxer who refused the draft. He was connected to the Nation of Islam. He was connected to figures that the FBI was actively monitoring and surveilling. He wasn't just controversial. In the eyes of the government and the security establishment, he was potentially dangerous. That's why his vindication took so long. That's why even after the courts ruled in his favor, the establishment remained suspicious of him. Brando, similarly, wasn't just an actor who refused his Oscar. He was deeply, organizationally involved in the civil rights movement. He was funding projects. He was meeting with activists. And he was doing this in a way that was actually illegal in some cases, funding organizations that were labeled as subversive. When these two men sat together in 1974, they weren't just two celebrities having a conversation. They were two men who understood that they were on the radar, that they were watched, that their activities mattered to people in power. And yet they were choosing to deepen their connection anyway. That was the real statement being made. Not a public statement. An internal statement. A statement that said, I will risk more for what I believe in. Beat 3. The core of the connection. Here's what Brando said to Ali in that conversation, according to people who were later told about it by Ali himself. You didn't just refuse to be used. You refused on principle when it would have been so easy not to. Most people, given the choice, they compromise. But you didn't. And that matters. And Ali's response was something like, but I'm still angry. I'm vindicated and I'm still angry. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Brando didn't have an easy answer. He told Ali the truth. Yes. That's exactly the way it's supposed to be. Because the anger means you haven't forgotten what was taken. The day you stop being angry is the day you've accepted the system. And that means you've lost. This is the moment that cemented everything. This is the moment when Ali understood that Brando wasn't offering him comfort or absolution. He was offering him permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to never fully reconcile with the system that had wronged him. Permission to maintain his outsider status, even after vindication. And for Brando, being with Ali in that moment meant something equally profound. It meant being in the presence of someone who had done what Brando himself had tried to do. Refuse the system entirely, without compromise, without calculation. It meant being seen by someone he respected as someone who had also made the right choice. They didn't call it brotherhood. They didn't make a speech about solidarity. They just sat together. And in that sitting together, two of the most famous men in the world acknowledged something that almost nobody else in their lives could acknowledge, that their real victories were the ones that had cost them everything. When Ali left Brando's house that night, something had shifted. They weren't just corresponding anymore. They weren't just admiring each other from a distance. They had now moved into a space of real intimacy, and that intimacy carried a particular kind of responsibility. Over the following months, they stayed in touch. They talked about what was happening in their respective worlds. They advised each other. And, this is crucial, they protected each other. When Ali was criticized in the press for this or that controversial statement, Brando would reach out. When Brando was dismissed as washed up or irrelevant, Ali would call him. They became each other's witnesses. Each other's proof that the sacrifice had meant something. But here's the thing that most people don't understand. This friendship also changed how they moved through the world. Ali became slightly more careful, more strategic, more aware that he had someone he didn't want to expose to harm. Brando became slightly more engaged, slightly less willing to retreat entirely. They pulled each other back from the edge, not into the system, but into connection. Into the understanding that isolation is a price you pay, but it doesn't have to be total isolation. Quick question for you. Have you ever had a relationship with someone that nobody else really knew about? A connection that mattered more precisely because it was private. Because the moment it became public, it would be diminished. Let us know in the comments if you understand what that feels like. After that initial meeting, Ali and Brando maintained their friendship for years. They didn't see each other constantly. They weren't photographed together. But they were in regular contact. And more importantly, they had become part of each other's inner circle in a way that mattered profoundly. In 1975, when Ali began to shift his public stance, when he started to reintegrate somewhat into mainstream culture while maintaining his principles, one of the people he consulted was Brando. And when Brando decided to take the role in Apocalypse Now, a decision that many of his associates thought was a sellout, he discussed it with Ali. They weren't always in agreement. They sometimes challenged each other. But there was a fundamental trust that they would understand each other's motivations. The friendship also made Ali more aware of something that Brando had been grappling with for years, the loneliness of being vindicated. You think vindication will feel like victory. You think that being proven right will feel like triumph. But what it actually feels like is that everyone who wronged you finally has to acknowledge you were right. It doesn't erase the wrongs. It doesn't give back the time. It just means you get to live with the knowledge that you were right, and it cost you everything. Ali began to use some of Brando's language when he talked about his years in exile. He started to frame it not as a sacrifice he regretted, but as a choice he was proud of. And Brando, seeing Ali move through this transformation, began to reconcile with some of his own choices. He stopped framing his career destruction as a failure. He started to see it as an act of refusal, which was exactly what it was. For decades, almost nobody knew about this friendship. Not because it was hidden, lots of people knew, but because nobody talked about it. The entertainment press didn't write about it. The sports media didn't write about it. It wasn't until years later, when people who had been in Ali's inner circle began to speak publicly, that the full extent of the connection became clear. Ali himself never went into detail about the friendship in interviews. When asked about his relationship with Brando, he would give vague answers, talk about respect, talk about seeing Brando's political work. But he never talked about the depth of it. He never talked about those private conversations. He never told the world that he had called Brando his white brother. Why? Because the moment you make a private truth public, it becomes something else. It becomes a narrative. It becomes a story that can be co-opted, misused, turned into something other than what it was. So instead, they protected it. They let it live in the private sphere, where it belonged. But here's what's significant: the people who knew about it, the people who were part of Ali's inner circle during this period, they all say the same thing. They say that Ali was different when he talked about Brando. He was quieter. He was more reflective. He was accessing something deeper than the public Ali that everyone knew. In 1976, when Brando's health began to decline, he had been gaining weight steadily, not from Marlon's legendary indifference, but from real, growing health problems. Ali was one of the few people he trusted to know about it. When Brando eventually had a stroke, when his health became a serious issue, Ali was concerned in a way that felt almost familial. Not friendship. Not exactly. Something deeper than that. Something like kinship forged through shared sacrifice. The real revelation didn't come until after Ali's boxing career was over. It came in interviews, in books, in conversations where Ali was reflecting on his life and his choices. He would mention Brando. He would talk about what it meant to know someone who had made similar sacrifices in a different arena. And gradually, slowly, the friendship became part of the public record, but it was never sensationalized. It was never turned into a spectacle. Even as people learned about it, even as it became part of the historical narrative of both men, it retained something of its original privacy. It remained a story about two men who understood something about conviction that most people don't have to understand. When Brando died in 2004, Ali released a statement that was simple and profound. He talked about Brando as someone who had lived according to his principles. He talked about him as a brother. And in that statement, which was brief and measured and deeply felt, there was an echo of what they had built together. Not in public. Not for the cameras, but in the private space where two extraordinary men had recognized something extraordinary in each other. The official story says one thing, that Muhammad Ali and Marlon Brando had a brief acquaintance, a mutual respect. But the deeper truth, the truth that the people close to them knew, is different. It's the story of two men who found in each other a mirror of their own sacrifice. It's the story of how the most profound connections sometimes happen in silence, protected and preserved precisely because they matter too much to be exposed to the machinery of public narrative. When we talk about Muhammad Ali and Marlon Brando as separate figures, as the boxer who refused the draft and the actor who refused Hollywood, we're missing something essential. We're missing the fact that their power came not from their rebellion alone, but from their refusal to be alone in their rebellion. They found each other. They witnessed each other. And in doing so, they validated something that our culture rarely validates. The reality that principle costs you everything, and that the only way to live with that cost is to know that someone else understands. This friendship reveals something crucial about Ali that the mainstream narrative often obscures. Ali wasn't just a fighter. He wasn't just a celebrity who took a political stance. He was a deeply thoughtful man who understood that his principles created a particular kind of isolation, and he was willing to do the work of building genuine connection with people who understood what that isolation meant. He could have surrounded himself with yes men and admirers. Instead, he chose to build authentic relationships with people who challenged him and understood him at the deepest level. And Brando, this reveals something about him that his late career often obscured. Despite what people said about him being lazy or difficult or indifferent, Brando was deeply committed to the principle of genuine connection. He didn't perform solidarity. He lived it. And when he found someone like Ali, someone who had paid the price of principle in real ways, Brando recognized it immediately and protected that recognition jealously. This friendship mattered because it created something that the world almost never sees: two of the most famous people of their generation choosing privacy, choosing protection of something real over public validation. In an era when everything was becoming spectacle, when civil rights was being commodified even as it was being fought for, Ali and Brando said no. They said that some things are too real to be public. Their friendship also mattered because it created a blueprint for what solidarity could look like. Not performative, not temporary, not designed to make anyone look better, but deep, sustained, mutual, and protected. It's a blueprint that we see very rarely in American public life, and certainly we see it less now than we did even then. And perhaps most importantly, this friendship mattered because it allowed both men to live with their sacrifice, because isolation is real, because the cost of principle is real, and because sometimes you can only survive that cost if someone else is there to say, "I understand. I paid a similar price, and it was worth it." So here's the question that this story leaves us with. If you could have a conversation with one person, anyone, someone you deeply respected, someone who had walked a similar difficult path to the one you've walked, what would you say to them? And what would it mean to have that conversation in complete privacy, protected from the world, belonging only to the two of you? What would you sacrifice to have someone truly understand you? To have a connection so real, so uncorrupted by the need to be public or validated or recognized, that it belonged entirely to the interior of your own life? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, which legendary friendship should we investigate next? The partnership between these two men changed the course of American culture. There are others like it, hidden beneath the surface of history. Which story do you want us to uncover? Muhammad Ali is gone. Marlon Brando is gone. But the story of what they built together, the proof that two of the most famous people in the world could create something genuine and real and private, that story lives forever. And it reminds us that the deepest human connections are not the ones the world gets to see. Here is the truth that died with them, both, but the legacy of their brotherhood lives on.